Martin Shkreli is jailed for seeking a hair from Hillary Clinton. Martin Shkreli, the former pharmaceutical executive who is awaiting sentencing for a fraud conviction, was sent to jail on Wednesday after a federal judge revoked his bail because he had offered $5,000 for a strand of Hillary Clinton's hair. Mr. Shkreli, who was free on $5 million bail while he awaited sentencing, had made 2 Facebook posts offering cash to anyone who could grab a hair from Mrs. Clinton during her book tour. At the hearing in federal district court in Brooklyn, Judge Kiyo A. Matsumoto said that Mr. Shkreli's post could be perceived as a true threat, that is a solicitation to assault in exchange for money that is not protected by the First Amendment, she said. Mr. Shkreli, 34, gained notoriety as a pharmaceutical executive for increasing the price of a life-saving drug, Daraprim, by 5,000%. He was convicted in August of 3 counts of fraud relating to 2 hedge funds and a pharmaceutical company he previously ran. On Wednesday, he was scheduled to be sentenced on January 16, but he most likely will not be released before then unless his lawyers can show that he poses no threat to the community. Mr. Shkreli's online offer last week prompted prosecutors to request that his bail be revoked, and the Secret Service to investigate. On HRC's book tour, "Try to grab a hair from her," he wrote, referring to Mrs. Clinton. "We'll pay $5,000 per hair obtained from Hillary Clinton." Although Mr. Shkreli edited the post to say that he had meant it to be satirical, and he later took it down altogether, prosecutors contended that there was a risk that one of Mr. Shkreli's social media followers would take the post seriously and act on it. It was, they noted, not the first time that Mr. Shkreli had made inflammatory posts on social media. Just before his conviction, prosecutors wrote, Mr. Shkreli had made a sexual threat toward a female journalist on Twitter. Since then, they wrote, Shkreli has engaged in an escalating pattern of threats and harassment. Mr. Shkreli's lawyer, Benjamin Brafman, argued at the hearing that Mr. Shkreli was not violent and that the post had been a momentary lapse in judgment. Mr. Shkreli, he said, deserved another chance. "Stupid doesn't make you violent," Mr. Brafman said, adding that his client's Facebook posts had shown immaturity, satire, a warped sense of humor. But Judge Matsumoto was unmoved. "What is funny about that?" she responded. "He doesn't know who his followers are." Judge Matsumoto said that while Mr. Shkreli had edited the original post to say, "This is satire, meant for humor," the next day he put up another post that echoed the first, $5,000 but the hair has to include a follicle. "Do not assault anyone for any reason ever, liberals." Mr. Shkreli, dressed in a lavender button-down shirt, was animated for much of the hearing, as he had been throughout his trial. But his behavior changed when Judge Matsumoto said that she had decided to jail him, and he sat quietly at the defense table for the rest of the hearing. After the hearing, 2 deputy United States Marshals led Mr. Shkreli to a holding cell adjoining the courtroom. He will be held at a federal jail in Brooklyn. 1A. U.S. judge has ordered Martin Shkreli, nicknamed Pharma Bro, to be jailed while he awaits sentencing for securities fraud, citing a Facebook post in which he offered a $5,000 $6,300 reward for a strand of Hillary Clinton's hair. U.S. District Judge Kiyo Matsumoto in Brooklyn said on Wednesday the post from September, which prompted a call from the U.S. Secret Service, showed Shkreli posed a danger to the public that warranted revoking his $5 million bail. U.S. prosecutors had moved to jail Shkreli last Thursday, saying he had engaged in an escalating pattern of threats and harassment. The former drug company executive, who got his nickname for exploits such as increasing the price of a life-saving drug by 5,000%, apologized for the post in a letter to the judge on Tuesday. "I understand now that some may have read my comments about Mrs. Clinton as threatening, when that was never my intention when making those comments," Shkreli said in his letter. "It never occurred to me that my awkward attempt at humor or satire would cause Mrs. Clinton or the Secret Service any distress." But on Facebook, Shkreli, 34, struck a more defiant note, posting this the same day prosecutors filed their motion to have his bail revoked. Shkreli's lawyers compared his online comments to the political humor of Kathy Griffin, who held up a photograph of a faux bloody head of President Donald Trump, and even to the comments of Trump himself. During the campaign, Trump used political hyperbole, Shkreli's attorneys said, when he claimed that Clinton, his Democratic rival, would abolish the Second Amendment if elected. By the way, and if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know, Trump said. In a letter to the court, Shkreli's attorney, Benjamin Brafman, said, indeed, in the current political climate, dissent has unfortunately often taken the form of political satire, hyperbole, parody, or sarcasm. While we do not condone Mr. Shkreli's comments, his constitutionally protected political hyperbole does not rise to the level of making him a danger to the community when he is not and has never been considered to be a danger. Combative presence. Shkreli said in the post, since deleted, that he needed the hair to confirm the sequences I have, an apparent reference to genetic testing. Shkreli was dubbed America's most hated man in 2015 after raising the price of AIDS drug Daraprim by 5,000% as then chief executive of Touring Pharmaceuticals. In August, he was convicted by a Brooklyn jury of defrauding investors in 2 hedge funds he ran, MSMB Capital and MSMB Healthcare. Though the charges carry a maximum sentence of 20 years, Shkreli will most likely serve much less, in part because none of the investors lost money. During the trial, the judge chastised Shkreli for speaking to reporters in the courthouse where jurors could potentially hear him. Prosecutors had complained Shkreli's comments, including mocking them as the junior varsity, were inappropriate and could taint the jury pool. Shkreli apologized after that incident too. Since his arrest in December 2015, he has clashed frequently with critics on social media. Twitter banned him from its platform in January for harassing a female journalist. Another incident prosecutors cited in their motion to revoke his bail. Following his conviction, he has kept an active, and combative, online presence. In addition to asking for someone to grab a strand of Clinton's hair, he has offered investment advice and announced the sale of the only known copy of a Once Upon a Time in Shaolin, a Wu-Tang Clan album that he bought for $2 million in 2015. I hope someone with a bigger heart for music can be found for this one-of-a-kind piece and makes it available for the world to hear, he added. The most recent bid is for $1,001,300, a potential loss for Shkreli. Notorious former pharmaceutical executive Martin Shkreli has been jailed after a U.S. federal judge deemed him a threat to the community for offering reward to anyone who could grab a hair from Hillary Clinton during her book tour. The New York Times reports Shkreli, who was awaiting sentencing after he was convicted last month of securities fraud, has had his $5 million (6.3 million Australian dollars) bail revoked. In a Facebook post that has been since removed, the 34-year-old dubbed the Pharma Bro offered $5,000 (6,262 Australian dollars) for anyone who could grab a hair from Mrs. Clinton during her ongoing book tour. A defense attorney for Shkreli argued in court papers that the offer to pay a bounty for securing a Hillary Clinton hair with a follicle while she was on a book tour was a tasteless joke comparable to some of U.S. President Donald Trump's derisive comments. Indeed, in the current political climate, dissent has unfortunately often taken the form of political satire, hyperbole, parody or sarcasm. Lawyer Ben Brafman was quoted as writing by the AP. There is a difference, however, between comments that are intended to threaten or harass and comments, albeit offensive ones, that are intended as political satire or strained humor. Judge Matsumoto failed to see the funny side of the post. What is funny about that? She was quoted as saying by the NIT. He doesn't know who his followers are. Judge Matsumoto said that while Mr. Shkreli had edited the original post to say, "This is satire, meant for humor," the next day he put up another post that echoed the first. $5,000 but the hair has to include a follicle. Do not assault anyone for any reason ever, liberals. Shkreli gained notoriety and was called America's most hated man by the media in 2015 when he hiked the price of Daraprim, a drug used to treat infections in HIV patients, from $13 to $750 17 Australian dollars to 940 Australian dollars per tablet. The strange case of Martin Shkreli is wrapping up. In February 2013, Martin Shkreli was contemplating a deal that involved acquiring shares of Daraprim, the pharmaceutical company he ran, at below the market price. His lawyer advised him to be careful, writing, "Not the best course of action. You are the director and CEO of a public company. You now have duty of loyalty and related issues." Mr. Shkreli crudely dismissed the advice. The email exchange was one of dozens of documents showed to jurors as the prosecution wound up its case against Mr. Shkreli, the pharmaceutical entrepreneur and former hedge fund manager. The defense did not call any witnesses on Wednesday. The fate of Mr. Shkreli will soon be in the hands of the jury, 5 men and 7 women, in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn. Mr. Shkreli is charged with defrauding investors at 2 hedge funds that he ran, MSMB Capital and MSMB Healthcare. Another count says that he defrauded Retrofin to pay back MSMB investors via settlement agreements that were never approved by Retrofin's board, and by sham consulting agreements. He is also charged with illegally controlling a huge number of Retrofin shares by handing them out to associates. Continue reading the main story. Related coverage. Martin Shkreli says he will not take the stand in his defense. July 24, 2017. Mr. Shkreli, 34, is best known for steeply increasing the price of Daraprim, a life-saving drug for a rare parasitic infection, and for his attention-grabbing behavior on social media, but the trial, now in its 5th week, does not concern those matters. The prosecution has argued Mr. Shkreli lied about several aspects of his hedge funds and work at Retrofin. In February 2011, when he was running MSMB Capital, he blew up the fund, in the words of one former employee, with a short sale on a pharmaceutical stock, losing almost everything. Mr. Shkreli, however, sent investors at MSMB Capital statements showing terrific returns, according to evidence introduced at the trial. The statements looked amateurish. They were emailed from Mr. Shkreli's address to investors, with fund results listed in the text of the emails. Even so, investors testified they believed the statements. The statements, added together, suggested that MSMB Capital had about $3.3 million in holdings in February 2011, and about $3.1 million in November 2011. The actual amounts in MSMB Capital's combined bank and brokerage firm accounts in those months, $58,502.00. The defense argued that Mr. Shkreli was factoring in the value of Retrofin when he sent these statements, and the statements specify he was giving investors the value of this investment, not the amount in the combined bank and brokerage accounts. One difficulty with this argument, while one of Mr. Shkreli's funds, MSMB Healthcare, invested in Retrofin, MSMB Capital never did. Prosecutors also argued that Mr. Shkreli lied about how MSMB Capital was vetted. In one PowerPoint sent to investors, MSMB listed an accounting firm as his auditor, and a law firm as his legal counsel. Both the defense and the prosecution have agreed that these firms never worked for Mr. Shkreli. While defense lawyers typically try to display their client's positive attributes, Mr. Shkreli's lawyers have painted him as an erratic misfit, to the point that the government has repeatedly objected to the defense team's unflattering portrayals of its own client. The goal of such a portrayal is presumably to get jurors to question whether Mr. Shkreli knowingly committed fraud, a key part of the charge against him. Prosecutors tried to make the point on Tuesday, though, that Mr. Shkreli knew what he was doing. In March 2011, a month after he had lost almost all of the funds in MSMB Capital on the bad trade, which involved a stock with the ticker symbol ORX, he asked an investor to be a reference for him for another potential investor. "Please sing my praises," Mr. Shkreli wrote. The investor asked, "Does he know ORX drama?" "Not aware of any drama," Mr. Shkreli wrote back. One charge has to do with Mr. Shkreli having undisclosed control over a huge portion of Retrofin shares. Prosecutors say he handed these shares out to people, including employees, but told them what to do with the shares. He then made it look as though the employees did not work for Retrofin or MSMB anymore, so they could claim they were not affiliates of the company, even though some were actually still working for Retrofin or MSMB, prosecutors said. Regarding another charge, the defense had argued that Mr. Shkreli did not know he needed board approval from Retrofin to send out settlement agreements, which had Retrofin compensate MSMB investors who had lost their money. But the emails show him fine-tuning the settlement agreements and telling his lawyer, in August 2013, that there were serious faults with the agreements, including lack of board approval. The defense has raised credibility issues with some of the witnesses, including showing that Retrofin board members never read one of the proposed consulting agreements in question, and that another man portrayed by the government as a fake consultant might have done real work for the company, at least in Mr. Shkreli's view. Mr. Shkreli's aggressive personality had been largely kept out of the trial, but it came through in the final round of emails shown by prosecutors. "Why can't you do your job? It is incredible," Mr. Shkreli wrote to his lawyer, Evan Griebel, who is also charged in the case and will be tried separately in the fall. "You're inept," he continues. "You're done." And in an August 2013 email to Retrofin's chief financial officer, who wrote that Retrofin's accounting firm had an issue with how the settlement agreements were handled, Mr. Shkreli responded, "Fix the issue," adding an expletive before issue. There is no issue. How many times do we have to talk about this? Until this week, the case had been, in some respects, a funhouse mirror version of a normal fraud trial. The people presented by prosecutors as Mr. Shkreli's victims actually made money. For one thing, the defense, usually eager to limit prosecution witnesses' testimony, had pushed the prosecution to call more victims. And the victims, usually the emotional heart of a fraud case, may be difficult for jurors to connect with. Every MSMB investor who testified at the trial made all of his or her money back with a handsome profit, as Mr. Shkreli eventually arranged for them to get some combination of cash and Retrofin shares. The victims were mostly rich, and not very sympathetic characters. One investor, Skylar Marshall, admitted on cross-examination that he could not pinpoint how much he had made selling his Retrofin stock. "You have no recollection of whether you made $40,000, $100,000 or $370,000? Benjamin Brathman, Mr. Shkreli's lawyer, asked. Mr. Marshall said he was not certain. His testimony was typical of the investors who testified. He said he was extremely impressed when he first met Mr. Shkreli, adding that Mr. Shkreli reminded him of Dustin Hoffman's character in the movie Rain Man. Mr. Marshall said he decided in January 2011 to invest $100,000 in MSMB Capital. By September, when, in reality, the fund had no money left, Mr. Shkreli sent an email with what he said was Mr. Marshall's June balance. The fund, Mr. Shkreli wrote, was up 79.49% since its inception, and Mr. Marshall's investment was close to $300,000. 37 minutes later, Mr. Shkreli sent an email to all of his investors, including Mr. Marshall, announcing that he was shutting down MSMB Capital and a sister fund, MSMB Healthcare, to focus on his new company, Retrofin. He offered investors cash or shares in Retrofin equal to their supposed holdings in MSMB. Mr. Marshall acknowledged on cross-examination that Mr. Shkreli had ultimately paid back my investment and then some. "Usually, the government uses testimony from victims to get into the consequences. Did you lose your house? Did you have to go into your retirement savings?" said Sarah Walters, a former federal prosecutor of economic crimes who is a partner at the law firm McDermott, Will & Emery. "This is flipped, in that you have a defendant spending a lot of time on, what's the ultimate effect on you?" Just from a jury appeal perspective, the prosecutors have to try to get the jury to understand why they should care about the investors' stories, Ms. Walters said. Mr. Shkreli, the 34-year-old biopharmaceutical executive, will be in court in Brooklyn next week to face securities and wire fraud charges. He is accused of improperly using money from a company he founded to pay back hedge fund investors. Mr. Shkreli has said that he is not guilty and will be vindicated at trial. Still, it was his handling of the price of a little-known drug, Daraprim, which is used to treat infections in AIDS patients and babies, that drew the ire of doctors, patients, insurance companies and even Hillary Clinton. Sneering defenses of price increases. In September 2015, Mr. Shkreli, who was then the chief executive of Turing Pharmaceuticals, bought the American marketing rights to Daraprim. Overnight, he raised its price to nearly $750 a pill from $13.50 and became the smirking symbol of drug industry greed. His sneering defenses of the price increase led to a social media firestorm, and federal and state investigations, That painted the boyish-looking former hedge fund manager as a pharma bro villain, a role he has embraced. Mr. Shkreli said raising drug prices was necessary to finance the expensive development of new medicines. He even said that a touring investor had threatened to beat the crap out of me for not raising the price more.